Life isn't fair, justice is blind and dysfunctional, and some cops aren't smart and dedicated like on television. This is Who Killed Teresa? First, some words about Francine Da Sylva, because this story is ultimately about Francine Da Sylva. I can't remember if it was in a podcast, but I've spoken many times about where she was found, that area having a strong influence on me, where she lived and her murder was committed. And the locus is Place Émilie Gamelin. That in itself is a focal point in Montreal. The main library, Banque, is located there. It's also where Berry-UQAM metro station is placed. It's one of the main terminals of the city's subway system. Archambault's is there, but will be closing this spring. It's a bookstore that has been an institution in the city for at least half a decade. My nephew worked there for years, and I used to drop in and surprise him whenever I was in town. I didn't know until recently that Place du Puy, an indoor shopping court across the square, known today more for homeless and drug problems, was the original location of Dupuis Frères, one of Montreal's most venerated department stores. And I could go on and on. Place Émilie Gamelin is like a magnet for me. I'm compelled to stay in the area whenever I visit Montreal. One time after dark, I went out photo exploring. And this is long before, I'd written about Francine Da Sylva. And I shot a picture of her apartment on Rue André without even having known Francine had lived there. So it's kind of strange in that it's a very unassuming building. The bus station is north of the square. I used to hang out there as a kid, and so did Francine and her friends, anonymous to each other. And then finally, I can't tell you the number of hours I've spent in that library, Banque, staring at microfilm of old newspapers, looking for clues and meanings. I believe, without question, that Edmond Turcotte murdered Diane Thibault. There's such specificity in his confession, such defiance in his posturing in court. But the judge let him go. Why? I would argue that Edmond Turcotte was protected. He served a low-level purpose to organize crime, and they would come to his aid when he needed assistance. Not for everything, of course. There are petty crimes where Turcotte met with justice, but nothing ever like murder. He's usually slapped on the wrist with a fine and the threat of serving time. But nothing for murder, which I believe he continued to commit throughout his criminal career. In 1978, while living in La Salle, Turcotte was charged with soliciting a prostitute. The attorney Réal Charbonneau also represented Turcotte in that process. In 1980, while living in Pointe-aux-Trembles, he was charged with manslaughter, though he appears to have beaten that sentence. Then in 1981, while living in Terrebonne, he was handed a 6-month sentence for minor infractions. There are almost 20 years where Turcotte does not appear to have been in trouble with the law. Then suddenly in 1997, he resurfaces in Saint Calixte area, where he was charged with theft. The legal process for the murder of Diane Thibault started after his arrest in late November 1978, and it dragged out all through the spring of 1979, with the judge's final decision not delivered until May 14th of that year, 1979. Charbonneau and Turcotte stuck together all through that process. There would have been telephone conversations and meetings for almost half a year. Through this process, Turcotte was incarcerated in the Parthenay jail at the Sûreté du Québec's headquarters near the Jacques-Cartier Bridge. Then all at once, he was set free in mid-May 1979. 2.5 months later, Nicole Goudreau was found murdered in an alleyway near the plateau. But Goudreau isn't murdered on just any Montreal summer night. She's found on August 3rd, 1979. Almost exactly 4 years from the date of the murder of Diane Thibault. Would Edmond Turcotte have celebrated his release from incarceration for the murder of Diane Thibault by murdering another woman on the anniversary of the Thibault killing? That's my question. Nicole Goudreau spent the evening of August 2nd at a bar called Baltimore at the corner of Saint-Hubert in Ontario. Like Thibault, Goudreau was severely beaten, then transported from a domicile to an open area. In Goudreau's case, an alley, which was also an abandoned lot, really. It was a field. And she was left there to die like Diane Thibault. At the time, Montreal police hypothesized that either she was attacked on the street by a stranger between the Baltimore and her destination 2 blocks away on Rue Saint-André, or her assailant had been drinking with her at the Baltimore and the two left the bar together. This second scenario matches Turcotte having partied with Thibault at the rodeo before taking her back to a rooming house and assaulting her. 6 years later, Francine Da Sylva is also on her way home after dark. Like Nicole Goudreau, she too has been out that evening. She meets a friend at La Fameuse at Mount Royal and Saint-Denis, and the two part ways at Saint-Denis and Duluth, with Francine making her way on foot back to her apartment at Saint-André. And yes, Saint-André is the same street where police found Goudreau's blood and belongings the night she was murdered. Francine's apartment is a mere 2 blocks from what is thought to have been the place where Nicole was attacked. Francine doesn't make it back to Saint-André. In fact, at Sherbrooke and Saint-André, she continues on the main artery of Sherbrooke, overshooting where she lived on Saint-André, perhaps because at this point she knew she was being followed and she wanted to remain in the public view of the heavily trafficked Sherbrooke. At Rue Saint Timothée, she is attacked. Francine is dragged into the alley behind the apartment building at 902 Sherbrooke Street East, where she is raped and stabbed repeatedly. Early in the process, police focused on a suspect named Raymond Charette. When arrested, Charette's clothes had evidence of blood on it. A second victim of an attack on the same day that Francine was murdered came forward and told police she was waiting for a bus on Rue Mont-Royal when she was forced into a vehicle by a man with a knife alleged to have been Charette. They drove around for a while on the plateau, and Charette eventually let her out of the vehicle. Charette was never charged with Da Sylva's murder. All of this is getting a little heady with streets and locations and dates. I will remind you again, there on the website there is a map. The Diane Thibault plot points from 75 are marked in blue. The Nicole Goudreau plot points from 1979 are marked in red. And then finally the Da Sylva geographic points from 1985 are marked in green in kind of a geographic profile. And, if you're not going to go to the map, I'll just tell you that the Thibault location is not contiguous with the other two. It's a little east, but Da Sylva's and Goudreau's overlap. Those geographic points overlap with each other. So I know we're dealing with an extraordinarily long timeline. 10 years, 75 to 85. Yeah, 10 years, 3 murders. However, I'm just pointing out possibilities. I'm not saying I know this. I don't know anything. I'm just pointing out possibilities. So go to the website theresaallore.com, TheresaAllore.com. Concerning what happened to Francine Da Sylva, over the years, others have offered theories. Christian Grabner from Coulopolis suggested to me rather recently that her murder could have been committed by Agostino Ferrere, a Quebec serial killer convicted of the 1990 rape and murder of Claire Sampson and Danielle Laplante. Ferrere is an excellent candidate. In 1995, he sexually assaulted 2 women in an apartment at Barrie and Ontario, 1 block west of the Baltimore where Nicole Goudreau was last seen in August 79. However, there's an age problem here. Ferrere was born in 1964. He would have been 16 when Goudreau was murdered. Not out of the question. My bigger issue is his MO. Ferrere committed his assaults indoors. Thibault, Goudreau, and Da Sylva were all found outdoors. And this is the same problem as when producers of the TV series, the Quebec television series, Sur les traces d'une tueur en série, tried to suggest that William Fife was responsible for all of the downtown murders in the Montreals in the 70s. And it's a bit like throwing a ubiquitous sleuthing blanket over the whole mess, right? Fife's MO was strictly daytime, indoors, ruse entry, and usually older women. Whoever killed Thibault, Goudreau, and Da Sylva was a night crawler. Fife's not our guy. Who could be our guy is Edmond Turcotte. He is often in the right place at the right time. He confessed to a murder with a very similar MO to those of Goudreau and Da Sylva. Outdoors, encounters on streets or in bars. Whoever killed Goudreau did it on the anniversary date of Thibault's murder, almost like a punctuation mark saying, I got away with murder. And Turcotte appeared to have gang or gangster-affiliated protection. He certainly had a high-powered lawyer on his side, a man who later rose to prominence as a defender of the Hells Angels in some of their most infamous cases in the province of Quebec. Turcotte rarely served time for his convictions. Usually he was given a slap on the wrist fine, something a high-powered lawyer could manufacture. When we catch up with Turcotte nearly 20 years later, he's living in Saint Calixte, an area well known for Hells Angels inhabitants. And there's one more thing that makes Edmond Turcotte unique. He had an association with the assassinated mob lawyer Frank Shoofey. One of the most interesting things about Francine Da Sylva's murder on October 18th, 1985, is that 3 days earlier, Frank Shoofey was gunned down on October 15th, 85. And not only that, Shoofey's law office on the 5th floor of that apartment building on Rue Cherrrier is 2 blocks from the alley where Da Sylva was stabbed to death. Standing at the entrance of that alley on Saint Timothee, you can see Shoofey's building in the distance up on the hill. Edmond Turcotte knew Frank Shoofey. At his interrogation for the murder of Diane Thibault on November 23, 1978, the first thing Turcotte tells the coroner and police is, "My lawyers are not here this morning. They are supposed to arrive this afternoon. Mr. Shoofey and Charbonneau." So this is the same thing that played out 2 years later, where Shoofey and Charbonneau initially shared a case, but Charbonneau eventually ended up holding the bag for Frank. Recall the case. Réal Charbonneau was charged with contempt of court for failing to show up to represent his client, a man accused of kidnapping and rape of a 13-year-old. Charbonneau alleged that the error was due to a mix-up with his legal associate, Frank Shoofey. Charbonneau and Shoofey often worked on cases together in this era. And in this case, Shoofey decided that Charbonneau would represent the case of the pedophile solo. The one problem was that Shoofey had failed to notify Charbonneau, and he had drawn the shortest straw in this affair. Something like that might have irked Charbonneau. In fact, it could have pissed him right off. Over the years, there's been a lot of speculation about the motive for Frank Shoofey's assassination. And the consensus appears to be that it was a mob hit. Quebec crime writer Michel Auger has written that it was likely mobsters were the killers of Shoofey, with Claude Grant, an attorney who articled under Frank, adding that the Montreal underworld had a contract out on Shoofey a year before the actual murder. It's a little complicated, but at its heart, Shoofey had influence on the Hilton family. Not the hotel Hiltons, not Conrad Hilton. This was a family of boxers. The Hiltons were set to sign an agreement with American boxing promoter Don King. Shoofey publicly advised against this, which put him in the crosshairs of Montreal Mafia boss Frank Catroni. Frank Catroni, who was representing the Hiltons, wanted the deal with Don King to go through. Catroni was on the verge of being extradited to Connecticut on charges of heroin trafficking. He needed the money to pay for his legal defense. And by the way, his lawyer was Sidney Leithman, who we've already met. Shoofey was becoming too much of a nuisance for Frank Catroni, so he put a contract out for Frank's murder. There's also a theory that the hit on Shoofey had nothing to do with the Catronis, but everyone does agree that it was a mob hit. When a contract is issued, someone has to carry out that contract. And we've seen an example of how this can be carried out, or was carried out in that era. In 1969, a Sherbrooke businessman wanted his partner in the Pat's Fried Chicken franchise murdered. So he ordered a contract out on Roland Giguère to be carried out by a local hood named Yvan Charland. Charland then had two thugs, the brothers Regis and Jean-Claude Lachance, execute that contract for $10,000, allegedly. So if Frank Catroni wanted someone murdered in 1985, he might do something similar. He'd order a contract for the murder of Frank Shoofey, and then someone would find a low-level guy to carry that out for $5,000 or $10,000. We've also seen how lawyers like Sidney Leithman were well acquainted with underworld figures, and how the lawyer Réal Charbonneau was not above getting involved in criminal activities. He was sentenced for forging a false affidavit about the bombing of an apartment building on de Maisonneuve Boulevard in 1984 that killed 4 people, a document which he said Sidney Leithman drew up. There's an element of geographic profiling to this theory. It suggests that criminals habitually stick to familiar territory. Turcotte hunted in the area around Sherbrooke and Saint-André because he had dealings in that area as early as 1978, where one of his lawyers was officed. Then he ended up assassinating that lawyer. This is not unlike the urban section around King and Wellington and Sherbrooke, Quebec. Regis Lachance, Jeannie Charland, and Luc Gregoire, they all lived in that area, also around 1978. It's where they partied at the Moulin Rouge, which was like the Rodeo, where Gitanes and Atom gang clubhouses were located, where some of them committed arsons, abductions, maybe murders. It's also where the criminal courts are located. Like Turcotte periodically visiting Shoofey, Lachance, Charland, and Gregoire spent many days in court hearings in the same area where they committed their crimes. There's a nagging component to all of this that I'm omitting, possibly that I should omit, but it keeps kind of tugging at my pant leg, so I'm just going to bring it up. Probably regret it, but it's phone calls. There's this odd theme of anonymous phone calls in this narrative, and they probably mean nothing, but I'm nosy by nature, so here it is. Turcotte's brother-in-law, Roger Moreau, remember him? He makes the anonymous phone call to the police saying, if you're looking for Diane, look for Edmond Turcotte. Then he hangs up. There's also the anonymous phone call that was made in the case of Nicole Goudreau's murder from '79. Somebody called up and stated, I just killed a woman. You'll find it in the vacant lot of Rue Saint-André. Then hung up. And I'm not done. The English language newspaper The Gazette received a call after the Shoofey murder, where the caller explained, I and my colleague have assassinated Frank Shoofey. Good riddance. Now, they also claim an affiliation with the Red Army Liberation Front, something everyone believes to have been like a ruse to throw police off the trail of the real killer. So there's all these calls. And I guess I'm bringing this up because 2 years before the Goudreau murder, someone called the police after the Montreal murder of Catherine Hawkes in 1977, saying almost the exact same thing as the Goudreau case. He explained that he had killed a woman and where they could find the body. If you're looking for the whole Catherine Hawkes story, I don't have time to go into it today, but it's linked on the site teresalord.com. And one final thought before I kind of draw this whole package to a conclusion. I reached out to Réal Charbonneau, the attorney for this story, and he replied once, confirming his law office today is located in Old Montreal, and then he ignored all my subsequent emails and phone messages.
I give you my affection and I give you my time. Try to get a connection on the telephone line. You're so close, but far away. I call you up all night and day.
I suggest that someone got word to Edmond Turcotte that he could make some fast money by carrying out the contract killing of Frank Shoofey. The execution of a man he knew. He had most likely been to the office on Rue Cherrrier on numerous occasions. He was familiar with the area. He possibly murdered Nicole Goudreau in that vicinity in 1979 on the anniversary of the murder of Diane Thibault. And he was there again just 3 days later after Shoofey's murder when he most likely stabbed and sexually assaulted Francine Da Sylva. So in this theory, the values are Shoofey, Da Sylva, Goudreau, and Thibault. Solving for X requires moving the Turcotte variable to the other side and seeing if the two sides add up. But solving for X has more significant implications. Do you recognize the pattern? Where X are Quebec unsolved murders, then on the other side we have all these broad themes, these variables. Biker and gang activity. Police forces unwilling to go the distance to solve murders. The destruction of case evidence. Innocent women caught in the crosshairs of gang members' extracurricular activities. Lawyers cutting corners and cutting deals. Coroners making deals with lawyers. Weak, easily manipulated judges. We see it here with Turcotte, Da Sylva, Goudreau, Thibault, and we've seen it before. The murder of Teresa Martin and the involvement of bikers. The murder of Teresa Allure and Roland Giguère and Carol Fecteau. And Regis Lachance, also a gang member. All of this is speculation. But after decades, with Montreal and Quebec police seemingly taking no interest, showing no curiosity in this criminal investigative affair, speculation is a weapon of last resort. Someone needs to lift a finger and at least try to bring some sense of conclusion to these unsolved murders. This is Who Killed Teresa. If you like the podcast, you can follow us on social media. Go to the website, teresaallure.com, TheresaAllore.com. And to the right, you'll see links to all of our accounts on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Substack, etc. Please subscribe to the newsletter on Substack. That's at johnallure.substack.com. You can sign up for free, or you can sign up and become a paying patron. Either works for me. Just so long as you sign up and you spread the word through. You can write us a review. You can share the post, share this post with your friends and your social media groups. It would be greatly appreciated. That's all I have for today. Just kind of my last word. If someone were to ask me, do you have any final thoughts, any additional thoughts on the murder of Francine Da Sylva, that's what I would offer. And Nicole Goudreau and Diane Thibault, and then as a bonus, Frank Shoofey, of all people. This has been Who Killed Teresa. I'm your host, John Allure. Have yourselves a great day.
I'm going to let you stay in the film business. Finish the change. I like a bit of a cabal. I don't tell him to listen to his letters. I apply a bit of pressure.
Space sky fell from the sky, scratch my head and wonder why. Time slides into time across international dateline. Scientists eats bubble gum, Hall of Fame baseball, senators a hoodlum, big chiefs in a hall. Major line is relativity, only buildings, no people prophecy. Time slide, place too high, no reality. Foresight, mind wide, magic imagery, straight thoughts, fear to dread, placed upon the screen instead. She's my flame too hot to hold, had to settle for a cold. Burglars, Greek god, gold discovery. Gone bust, type rod, slow recovery. Axe drop, flamethrower, iron bar and gun. Betting shop, new owner, a walk in the sun. Major line is relativity, only buildings, no people prophecy. Time side, place too high, no reality. Foresight, minds wide, magic imagery, Spread the news, the maestro's back with the beatball soundtrack. King of brains, queen of the sack. Executives have heart attack. It's a so-called celluloid the money makers would avoid. Sometimes motions get reversed. Center of the universe. Ritual ideas, relativity. Only buildings, no people prophecy.
The Lone Ranger. You're Jack the Lad. Putting a little stick of that. Putting the finest on flash little twerp. He's an ignorant boy. And out of date more. United we stand, divided we're numbered. That's death. Who's left holding the sodding baby? I don't think it's too bad a clientele. They're a bunch of liars and ruthless. Give them a bit of spit.